Can you give us some background as to why you came to this decision, which must have been tough?
Over the last 16 months, I had watched Harvard behave in ways that were repeatedly flying in the face of the values of the work I thought I was trying to do.
Do you believe that Harvard has pro-Israel funding, backing, and is overtly biased towards Israel?
The short answer to that is fundamentally biased towards Israel is yes. I don't think it's exceptional in that regard, though.
Is it just geopolitics? What is it that makes it so unacceptable to call out Zionism in the US?
Maybe most important to some extent in my mind is the role that Israel plays in American foreign policy.
Hello and welcome to The Muslim Viewpoint, a new video podcast series powered by the non-profit media platform American Muslim Today. I'm your host, Rifat Malik, and today we're joined by Jay Ulfelder, the former program director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Nonviolent Action Lab and a human rights advocate. He's recently resigned from his position in protest at the university's decision to define certain criticisms of Israel as anti-Semitic in its school's non-discrimination policies, as well as their response to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I spoke to him earlier. Welcome to the show, Jay. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, I wanted to start, obviously, by discussing your decision to resign from your position at Harvard. Can you give us some background as to why you came to this decision, which must have been tough?
Yeah, where to start? It's sort of a, not end, obviously, but a inflection point in a lifetime journey, I guess. The short version of it is, I've been working at Harvard for about 4 years, or had been, for the Nonviolent Action Lab, which researches civil resistance around the world. Obviously, a core value of the lab and of the center that we were part of is the promotion and defense of democracy. And over the last, 16 months, I had watched Harvard behave in ways that were repeatedly kind of flying in the face of the values of the work I thought I was trying to do in repressing the student movement at Harvard in support of Palestinian liberation and against the genocide in Gaza. And, Harvard, like many U.S. universities, saw an encampment in support of folks in Gaza and Palestinian liberation in the spring of last year. Many of the participants in that encampment suffered significant disciplinary consequences. The university was consistently surveilling them. It then, after the encampment, like many universities, adopted new rules around protest activity on campus that were substantially shrinking space for what, in my mind, is normal student political behavior. And a core part of the experience of being in a university. And then as I watched, this is all, of course, happening in the context of larger politics in the United States. So, and it's very much a part of those same larger trends. And so I was, as we saw Trump win re-election, I was hoping this was an opportunity for the university to kind of find its soul on these things and start revisiting some of those values. Instead, all the signs were pointing in the opposite direction. And the particular kind of breaking point for me was the university's decision to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism.
Which is the international, I was just going to say, it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition.
Yes, exactly.
So why is that so problematic, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, again, in itself, it's problematic because of how it conflates opposition to Zionism and opposition to Israeli policy with anti-Semitism and makes those kind of protected classes. And again, this is one piece of a larger definition, but that was the core piece for me, kind of making Zionism, implicitly or explicitly a protected class, which as someone, I've off and on throughout my now 30 plus year career as a political scientist done research on ethno-nationalism of various forms in various parts of the world. Zionism is very much an ethno-nationalist movement. I, would find it ridiculous for any university to imply that various other ethno-nationalist movements around the world deserved, protection from criticism as part of speech at a university. But that's very much what it seemed to me this was doing. So that was the specific part. But again, it was crucial that this felt like it was just part of this continuous ratcheting of down of space for speech, very specifically around Palestine and Israel, but also more broadly, and part of this kind of larger, fascist push that we're seeing in the United States and globally right now. So it felt like that was kind of a bright line that got crossed, and a point where I thought it was important to speak publicly in some way about resisting that, and in solidarity with the students and activists and Palestinians, worldwide, putting so much energy into this.
I just wanted to quote from your resignation letters. Well, there was some obviously very powerful parts in that letter. And at one point you did say that at each fork in the road, Harvard's leadership seems to have chosen the path that prioritizes the university's funds and reputation over its students and its stated values. And you also, obviously, I think you've also just said that you were hoping that it would rediscover its moral voice. So do you believe that Harvard has pro-Israel, funding, backing, and is overtly, biased towards Israel?
The short answer to that is fundamentally biased towards Israel is yes. I don't think it's exceptional in that regard, though. I think it's important to view all of this again as part of this larger political structure and culture in the United States. So it's not that I think there's some, specific conspiracy, of folks manipulating Harvard in some special way. It's just, it very much reflects this broad, American kind of center right conservative-ish consensus around so many issues, including this one. And so it does feel, though, like leadership at the level of the Harvard Corporation. Isn't that ironic that that's the body that what we call the body that runs a university, or not runs it, but administers it and manages its funds, and then has so much control over life there. I do think that at that level, it is inherently biased. And I think, what I've learned a lot from colleagues in the last year is how many Palestinian American or Muslim American colleagues have, for many years, this wasn't, I'm like a lot of, like white guy Americans, this was not something I was exposed to and as familiar with. And, but, learning of how so much of this wasn't new for them. And that's old at Harvard, and it's old at so many universities. It's very old in the United States. So yes, I think that is the case at Harvard. I don't think that Harvard's exceptional in that way. What I do think is exceptional about Harvard is the power of the brand it wields, and its sort of symbolic power in our imagination of higher education, the role it plays in how the media talk about what's going on in higher education, the role it plays in producing people who lead institutions and governments all around the world, or are judges or CEOs or elected officials. And so it does play this outsized role. And I think in some ways that made me have less tolerance than I might have at some other institution for these kinds of politics. Like it seems like it is more freighted and has much more weight. I'm not trying to give them flatter the ego of the Harvard brand, but I do think that power is there, and that makes it more it matters in ways that it might not at places
I mean,
that draw
obviously,
less
it's
attention.
an Ivy League university with an international reputation, so
Yeah,
it has kudos. So, as you say, you see Zionism as an ethno-nationalist project. It has racist, it has authoritarian governance, and I think you also said violent boundary maintenance are all elements of it. I mean, you partly answered that question, but it just seems intrinsically in the U.S. criticism of Zionism, it seems is equated with anti-Semitism, but it just seems so, unlike, for instance, in the UK, where I'm from originally, it doesn't seem to have that same, correlation.
yeah.
Is it just geopolitics? What is it that makes it so unacceptable to call out Zionism in the US?
I'll start a response to that with the caveat that I'm not a deep expert on Zionism in the United States or the history of its role
Origins?
in American Jewish culture and all that. So I just want to put that out there. I do
Yeah.
think it matters that there's kind of an aligning of forces in a way, or of interest, kind of commonality of interest across some coalitions in the United States that maybe aren't there in some other places. So one of them being obviously folks who are, Zionist Jews in the United States, or who, so that's one piece of it, the role it's come to play in American Jewish culture. But I think at least as important, maybe most important to some extent in my mind, is the role that Israel plays in American foreign policy and imperialism, and as a kind of outpost of American power in a region that where those are hard to find for reasons that are very much America's own making. But so this is the kind of the battleship, the bulwark, the toehold, and so you've got this, what's the word, the blob, the kind of Washington foreign policy blob. It's not a partisan thing. It's very much just baked into American political culture across parties, that Israel is this essential ally in this dangerous part of the world, and therefore this relationship and this country is worth protecting to the extreme. And we were seeing this again with all the language around, in the last 16 months around, in so many ways, but one that all kept catching my eye is, the longstanding obsession with Iran in the
Mm.
American foreign policy community, of this as this, one of a very small set of super dangerous rivals in the world. And so it seemed like this, you can't, anything that would undermine Israel would undermine America's leverage against Iran. And, so you get into all this. So there's this alignment of very powerful political interest there. And then you've got the Christian Zionist faction, which has grown substantially. This part of the evangelical Christian community, which plays certainly an outsized political role in the U.S., I think, relative to even in other countries with substantial, Christian populations. This peculiar evangelical, kind of simultaneously anti-Semitic but super pro-Israel collection of people. But again, it constantly blows my mind that Jewish Americans are comfortable making alliance with these people who,
Yeah.
anyway, leave that for another moment.
Yeah.
But I think those two added elements are so powerful, why Zionism is considered such a sort of fundamental thing in American political culture, and something, that relationship with Israel needs to be protected, and Israel needs to be protected in this way that maybe isn't the same in other NATO countries, other.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the Senate hearings back in December of 2023.
Yeah.
Obviously, your president at the time, I think UPenn, MIT, they were all being publicly grilled in these, public hearings. Well, they were being accused primarily of anti-Semitism and not protecting Jewish students. And I think, if you recall at the time, Harvard's president, Claudine Gay, she received some backlash, but she stayed on as president. What did you make of her posture during the hearings, and also her subsequent decision to resign over Harvard, which, I don't know that it was directly to do with her role as president during the protests, but obviously there would have been some connection.
I'll admit that I have not, until fairly recently, been a close follower of the internal politics of Harvard, which seems funny given why we're talking.
Yeah.
And I have actually worked remotely throughout my time at Harvard, so that there's kind of this funny relationship with the university and university community for me, or an unusual one.
Right.
Again, that's just context to say that I have no special insight into what the politics were around her resignation. I was troubled at the time, and that was one piece of the kind of parade or cascade of disappointments with the university, for somebody who seemed like exactly the kind of leader I'd like to see at the university. And I think in general, I think she was trying to navigate kind of an almost impossible situation of satisfying the corporation, donors, et cetera, folks in Congress, folks who are critical of the universities and Congress's approach to these things. It was almost an impossible task. I have no idea what it's like to be in front of a congressional hearing under that kind of
Yeah.
scrutiny. So I was a bit disappointed in her response at the time, not horrified by it, and then was very much disappointed to see her resign. I mean, it felt like one of those, like, my understanding was that she was effectively pushed out.
Hmm.
Again, that could be wrong, but it felt like one of many episodes in what I'd watched over the last couple of years, where people who I think shared the kind of the values of those student protesters, of folks organizing at Harvard, in many ways, were getting sidelined, pushed out, forced to fight these kind of rearguard battles over things that were not really fundamental to what they would hope to be doing with their time and energy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was an early one of many kind of dominoes or
Yeah. I mean,
moments of
specifically,
disappointment.
I remember the issue for a lot of particularly the right wing members of Congress was their refusal this is the presidents of these universities' refusal to, call out anti-Semitism, and
Yeah,
what they felt was a too much latitude towards free speech.
yeah,
And I just wondered, I wanted to just mention, we recently interviewed the writer, journalist Peter Beinart about his new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And I remember asking him about claims that many Jewish students and the media often seem to deliberately conflate
yeah.
anti-Israel protests with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Is that something that you observed when you were at Harvard during the protests? Did you see Jewish students being targeted for being Jewish? Was it anti-Semitism at times?
Yes, I saw. I had no personal experience of watching a Jewish student or seeing on social media. A lot of my work, most of my work for the past several years, has involved watching U.S. protest activity via social media and news media at
Yeah,
all throughout the United States. So I was watching a lot of kind of all the encampments simultaneously, all protest activity from the fall of 2023 around this issue across many universities. I saw almost no, at these organized protests, virtually nothing that struck me as overtly anti Semitic. I saw a lot of people decrying genocide, mass atrocities, calling for an end to violence. Often, of course, a lot of the stuff at the universities was focused on pushing for divestment. Also, and then varying degrees of pushing for Palestinian liberation in forms from not being specific about it all the way up to calling for the dissolution of Israel and full right of return and et cetera. But I never saw anybody saying that what this should involve is killing Jews, or Jews are terrible people, or anything like that. And again, as you were alluding to there, key part of the coalitions organizing these actions at these universities and in many other non-university contexts were Jewish groups. That's been the case throughout. They've been very prominent. Anti-Zionist and otherwise progressive Jewish groups have been an important part of that coalition.
and I would
And
say, just to add to that, Jay, I would say that a lot of the students were, they were progressive, anti-racist, left of center, I would say, a lot of those students. So it didn't
Yeah.
really add up. The way that they were being demonized. And I just wanted to also just mention now, if you recall, during when the campus protests first began, and this is very soon after the 7th of October, maybe within a day, Harvard's pro-Palestinian student groups came together, and they became the subject of a national media frenzy for
Yeah.
refusing to condemn Hamas in a public statement. Do you remember that? And these students were then doxxed, they were blacklisted, they lost
Yeah.
internships, opportunities, publicly vilified. Now,
Yeah.
would you say that their actions in that statement, if I don't know the exact wording, but would you say that their actions were provocative? Did they merit censure? Should they have? Was it their duty to call out Hamas or condemn Hamas?
I don't think I hate playing the role of scold of activists in general. I hate saying I think activists should have done this or said that,
Yeah,
and kind of, people pick their language and their battles for all kinds of reasons. And I think that looking at the bigger picture is more important. And I get that. I've been frustrated throughout, watching this movement with the efforts by people who, Zionists or otherwise, who support Israel, to kind of backfoot people who are pushing against the genocide and calling for Palestinian liberation by forcing them to, by trying constantly to force them to respond to questions about small bits of language or this, that, the other thing, rather than focusing on the larger goals that they're talking about. The whole throughout the fall, like we had this, however many weeks it was, kind of moment that's not a news cycle. I don't know how many news cycles that is at that point, but
yeah,
where arguments about, is from the river to the sea an anti-Semitic statement inherently, and is this
right,
calling for violence? And it ends up sucking so much energy from a movement that's purpose is liberatory, pro peace in its core, to be getting bogged down in these arguments about that. So I've always found those folks coming at people, engaging in activism in support of Palestinians, force them to start with things like, well, do you acknowledge Israel's right to exist, or do you condemn Hamas? It always feels like it's part of this larger game of forcing them onto defense and diverting their attention. So I don't, if what those students were feeling in that moment was that the core issue for them was this larger struggle they saw this moment embedded in, and how they understood Hamas's role, or the role of militant and nonviolent resistance in Palestine in the context of that. I'm not going to condemn them for sharing their understanding of those circumstances and how they were feeling in that moment, and not trying to force it into a language and checking a checklist that was going to make it more acceptable. I mean, whatever they were going to say wasn't going to be acceptable.
On that point, I was going to say, Jay, that I remember seeing, and I mentioned this to Peter Beinart as well, that I remember seeing a student, I'm not sure if she was from Harvard, speaking at, I think it was during an interview during NBC or one of the mainstream news channels, and she was asked to condemn Hamas. And she refused, I think maybe 3 or 4 times. The questioner gave her multiple opportunities. She said, "Are you sure you don't want to take this opportunity?" And every time she responded with, "No, I'm going to take this opportunity to focus on Palestinian suffering and the Palestinian plight of Palestinians, because I think for too long Palestinians and their suffering has been ignored. So I'm not going," which I did not read as her saying I condone what Hamas did or I'm a supporter of Hamas. I just saw her doing what you're saying, which is choosing her right to free speech, to say what was important to her, and to recenter, refocus those people who haven't had a voice for
Yeah.
decades, frankly speaking. So is that the kind of impression that you got? And I thought it was courageous to do that on a national platform. And obviously there were consequences. And I think already she had lost some
Yeah.
major, professional opportunities. For a lot of us who, were sympathetic to what's happened to the Palestinians, and I don't see us as pro-Palestinian, I just see it as pro humanity. It just
Yeah.
seemed like there was a genocide going on, and if we didn't speak up, but for students to stand up in that way, have you seen that kind of courage and that kind of resoluteness in students before or in recent times? I personally haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the student movement writ large has done that, and its resiliency in the face of everything that's been thrown at it over the past year exemplifies, I think, that kind of courage, and it was very much, the inspiration, what I was trying to support with the act of my own resignation, seeing myself as a supporter of that rather than somebody who's important in any way in my own right. Um, and I feel like at so many turns, yeah, that's been where the easy path for these students was to pack up those encampments and call it a day, was to rephrase their demands try to fit it into this tiny impossible box of language, that folks want to see them speak in. It was to respond to these new rules on campuses with quitting protesting. It would be to accept plea deals in the legal cases brought against them in many instances. And that's not what they've done. And I think that's fantastic. And that throughout many of those student organizers as well, just as the woman you're describing did, kept trying to recenter the conversation on what they saw as the important thing, which was the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza now, the larger context of Palestinian history that fits into, and to keep pulling the conversation back to that. And yeah, I've just continued to be have so much admiration for the students and others who have been putting so much energy and so much of their own credibility, life chances, all that on the line to keep pushing that.
And just Jay, finally, I mean, I think many would say that that's exactly what you have done by resigning. And I wanted to ask you just finally, just to crystallize what you've just been saying, which is, for all those people on the campuses across the U.S., at Harvard, elsewhere, who feel afraid to openly support the Palestinian cause. And I think you'd alluded to the fact that a lot of colleagues and people you knew who told you that that's exactly what they have felt over the years.
Yeah.
And I can also testify as a journalist in the US. I know many, many friends here and abroad, to be honest, who have similar, had similar experiences where they are not able to openly say what they feel, or can't see editorial policies and work that is clearly biased, but are unable to say anything. And I wonder what your message, for fear of retribution or backlash. So what is your message do you hope your resignation sends to them? And I know you're not elevating yourself in any way, and you're very modest about it, but nevertheless, you've taken this public position to resign from this prestigious university. What is the message that you hope that will send to others?
Primarily one of solidarity and support. I also want to acknowledge that not everybody's in a position to do something like resign or go public, that there are lots of ways to do that work. And I admire the many people who are doing that in all kinds of ways that we may not see. I deeply admire the folks who've been doing this for decades at great personal costs and professional costs, without a lot of visibility or any to that. That those are stories that get swept under the rug. I think part of my hope, I'm optimistic about the future, in part because of how prominent the student movement has been, that I feel like the culture really is changing. Like if you look at the polling stuff on, by generation, like it's so different with younger folks now, and what that foretells about the prospect for a different future. Folks like me, older folks who are in a position of more financial security, so you can take some risks. This is finding ways to use that privilege to help push that cause forward and demonstrate that it's not, this is not, it's weaker than, that those parts of the culture may be more fragile than I think we've accepted. And as folks continue to push and take these risks, I think we're really seeing that change. And part of why we're seeing all these rules and congressional hearings is fear, the fear that the threat of the change is real now, of pushing changes on these policies and on the larger culture surrounding them. So I just really hope, again, just so admire all the folks who keep pushing that along, and hope we can keep keep moving that momentum in the right direction.
Jay, I really want to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us, and also, for the position that you took. We covered the story at the time, and we got a really, huge positive response. Certainly in our community, it was the American Muslim community. It was really widely respected. So, just thank you so much for speaking us today, and best of luck with your future, and hopefully you'll stay strong as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me on Muslim Viewpoint. If you value our public service journalism, please support American Muslim Today, a 501c3 nonprofit, by following us on social media at American Muslim Today, or donating at AmericanMuslimToday.com. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Rifat Malik.